Hi everybody. I was in class today and my professor said something very interesting. He said something that I've always agreed with, but I've actually never heard a professor say it before. He brought up cultural Marxism and he said that cultural Marxism isn't necessarily the best way to look at history from that perspective. It isn't. I've always agreed with this looking at history from a perspective of political correctness isn't necessarily the best way to look at history. Now that I an example of this would be that usually in history we study the conquest of the Americas. For example, the Aztecs and the Spanish, Cortez and Montezuma, 1519 to 1521, the war with the Aztecs, 1519, the Spanish land in what is today Mexico. Okay, they end up conquering the Aztecs. Why? Disease. They did horrible things to the Aztecs, and were taught that the Spaniards were bad, that the Europeans are bad, the Europeans were wrong, the Europeans have committed genocide. Well, that is true. Absolutely. Without question, that's true. But also, you have to look at it from a different perspective. What if the tables were turned? Okay? What if the Aztecs had horses? What if the Aztecs had a navy, which they did not, nor did they have horses? What if the Aztecs had metal instead of obsidian? And what if the Aztecs had the technology to travel all the way to Spain and Portugal? They land in the Iberian Peninsula. What do you think the Aztecs would have done to the Spanish? See, a lot of people who are politically correct, they won't twist it like that. They won't look at it like that. They'll just say the Europeans are bad. Now, this is not what my professor said. This is what I'm saying. They would say that the Europeans are bad, the European culture is bad, the European culture is to dominate and conquer and destroy. Well, for the most part, yes, that's what they did. But does that make their culture any more violent or worse or more savage than any other culture if they had the lesser technology? I would argue no. I would argue that violence and evil really can't be attributed to maybe a culture. It's more of it's human nature. And if you look at it from a Hobbesian perspective, many of you who are into philosophy, I more agree with I agree with Thomas Hobbes as opposed to John Locke on on the state of nature. Hobbes came up with this theory on the state of nature. Imagine, take away the existence of God in this hypothetical world. Take away the existence of God. God does not exist. So you don't have to. You're not going to hell for anything you've done. You could do anything you want to anybody. You won't be punished by this divine being because God doesn't exist. Take away all the laws of man. There are no laws. There are no government. There's nothing. They're just human beings in their natural state. How would human beings behave? That's important. How would they behave? Would they be good to one another? Would they be bad? I believe that human beings would be violent and cruel and vicious to one another. And I believe rape and murder would skyrocket. And I believe that we would live in a very dangerous, sad world because this is human nature. So I can't agree with political correctness when they argue historically that the Europeans are or were horrible, horrible people. And a lot of people would say, well, anything that happens to the Europeans now, that's fine because they get what's coming to them because of all the historical injustices and inequalities from the past. I don't think that's fair at all. And and that's how I feel about it. I've always felt that way about political correctness. And when we study history, we have to remember, look, just because one culture dominated another That doesn't mean that if the tables were turned, that other culture wouldn't have been dominated themselves and enslaved themselves. So that's how I feel about political correctness. When many professors will do this. They'll study history and they'll say, well, because the Europeans dominated, because they had advanced culture and advanced civilization, because they did. And don't get me wrong, the Aztecs were highly advanced. Many other cultures and civilizations were highly advanced. The Aztecs had a prison system. They had religious ceremonies. They had a city with, I don't know, they argue between 100,000 to maybe 150, 200,000 people. Doesn't mean they weren't advanced, but it means their technology wasn't as great. And they were wiped out by disease and help from the other indigenous people in the area, helping the Spanish. So that's how I feel about cultural Marxism. I agree that political correctness must come to an end, especially from a historical perspective when we study history. There are always two sides to a story.